Thank you. Good to be with you. I did want to mention that being an academic with a sense of humor is setting a very low bar, actually. So hopefully I will exceed that. I want to thank you for that introduction, and you can get kind of an idea of the range of things I was asked to talk about by that introduction. I was asked to talk a little bit about the demographic change that's occurring here and in the country. I was asked to talk a little bit about the uncertain state of the economy and what it means moving forward. I was asked to talk a little bit about what the implications of that were for community development and housing. I was asked to talk about the importance of building a broad social movement that would link together innovation and inclusion. I was then asked to talk about the risks of gentrification in Seattle, including a parcel-by-parcel analysis of many of the places where you're trying to develop. I was then asked whether or not I could provide a brief economic analysis of the $15 an hour minimum wage and sort of a landscape to the political way to kind of put that together, followed by a brief discussion of Crimea and Ukraine. I was then asked to discuss, I couldn't believe it, immigration reform and whether or not that would pass, particularly because John Boehner with his orange skin seems like he's from another planet, so it'd be in his interests. And then finally, I couldn't believe this, on the way in, I was literally asked by the leadership whether Seattle, with its reputation for Seattle nice, would have a chance at getting the Clippers to come here. Because we've got a reputation for LA rude. So that's a lot to do in what is a short keynote, or what we in Spanish call a keynotito. So what I'm going to do instead is talk a little bit about some of that, the demographic change, but I really want to focus in on sort of a central thing that got lifted up, which is why it is that the idea of inclusion is actually key to generating economic growth and economic sustainability rolling forward. So that's kind of what I'll talk about. One thing I always like to say before I get started talking, some of you have seen me know I say this, I actually have a speech disorder that's called spasmodic dysphonia. It's a speech disorder where sometimes the muscles on the side of your neck sort of clench, and as a result, while I'm talking, my voice might break. It's not because I'm being emotional, although believe me, it's really emotional being with you. It's because of this. And it's an affliction that Diane Rehm from NPR has. Some of you may know that. And I always like to reassure audiences that it gets treated once a month with Botox, which is true, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So let's bring the slides up. So, you know, for some of you, the happiest day of the year might be your birthday, or Christmas, or Hanukkah, a high holiday. For some of you, it might be today, because it's the HDC Luncheon. For people like me, the happiest day of the year is the day the census releases its demographic statistics. I mean, it's just joyful, right? It's like Christmas. There's toys, and you can play with them. And one of the things that we noticed when we looked at the census statistics for the nation that got released with the last major census was that the growth rate for Latinos in the United States was 43% over the previous decade. The growth rate for Asian Pacific Islanders, 43% over the previous decade. The growth rate for African Americans, about 11%. The growth rate for non-Hispanic whites, about 1%. So 43%, 1%. I still remember on the night of the election when President Obama won re-election with 39% of the white vote, and all the commentators are going, my God, how did that happen? And I kept thinking, where were you when I was giving speeches through the last year about the demographic changes that are going on in the country? So big demographic changes. We're going to take a look at what's going on in the Seattle metropolitan area in just a second. But one really key thing to know about this, and it's partly true in Seattle, though it's a little bit different here, is that demographic change. When most people see, in particular, the growth rate of Latinos at 43%, the growth rate of Asians at 43%, what do they think is driving that? Immigration. And that answer is wrong. Immigration into the country has been slowing down for the last 4 years, not just a function of a slower economy or increased border enforcement, but also stronger economies in Latin America and Asia, but most important, change in the fertility rate in Mexico. In the course of her lifetime, 35 years ago, a Mexican woman would have 5 children. The current fertility rate is 2.3. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. As those two come together, the push factor from our largest sending country declines, and as a result, net migration from Mexico over the last 3 to 4 years has been 0. There's as many Mexicans going back to Mexico as are coming into the United States. So what's driving us is no longer immigration, but children, and we'll see that in just a second. What does this look like in Washington? Slightly faster growth rates for both Latinos and Asians, but also for non-Hispanic whites. And in Seattle, very low growth rates for non-Hispanic whites, 1%. Your African-American population your black population, I should say, is still growing, partly African-American, partly the large increase in your black immigrant population, African immigrant population, your Latino population up by about 90%, your Asian population by about 60%. So it's the next America, and it's the next Seattle. And it's Latinos and Asians that are driving growth and change, in particular in the Seattle metropolitan area, and interestingly all over, not just in the central city, but in your suburbs as well. So for example, in the 1990s, about 70% of your net population growth, in the 1980s, 70% of your net population growth came from non-Hispanic whites. In the last decade, only 7% of your net population growth came from non-Hispanic whites, the bulk of it coming from the Latino population and the Asian population. It's a new Seattle, and you'll see that in just a second. So again, what's driving us in Seattle? Partly it's still immigration, but for the rest of the country, and that is your future, it's really the kids. So when you look at this is the change in the youth population between 2000 and 2010. In that 10-year period, the number of non-Hispanic whites below the age of 18 in the United States actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News, and it would have been blamed on Obamacare, even though Obamacare hadn't yet been put in place. What it means is that more people are moving into 19 and 20 than are moving into 1 and 2, so the net population declines. The number of young African Americans fell by about 250,000. Some of that's redesignation into the multiracial category, but not as much as people would think. The number of young Latinos up by 4.8 million. The number of young APIs, Asian Pacific Islanders, up by 800,000. So that's where the growth is coming from, and it's where it's coming from in Seattle, as Washington State as well. So this shows you the population growth rates, and in Washington, the youth population of whites fell by about 11%, the African American youth population up by about 9%, the Latino youth population by about 70%, the Asian youth population by about 40%. So these are big demographic changes, and it's part of the reason why it's now projected that the United States will become so-called majority minority, or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time. Everyone's a minority. Yeah, welcome to my party. So that's probably going to happen around 2043, but interestingly, the statistics that are far more interesting are this. 10 years before that, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. 10 years before that, the majority of young people, folks under the age of 18, will be people of color. So that's our new workforce, that's our new future. How do we adjust to it? And one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that that transition is actually occurring in the Seattle metropolitan area much quicker. If you look at the United States in 1980, the United States was 80% white. Seattle was 88, nearly 90% white. Many people wearing Birkenstocks, right? But you can see that the United States takes until 2050 to become 45% non-Hispanic white, Seattle reaches that in 2040. So you're a little bit of America fast forward. California is really America fast forward. Los Angeles is America on steroids. So what do these changes mean? You've got a slightly higher immigrant share than the rest of the country. And now let me go through some of the implications of this. So one of the things that's going on, you can see this by looking at Seattle, is that initially when people think about the demographic change in the country, the thing that they tend to think about is that, oh my gosh, what's going on is the demographic change is going to happen in the country, but it's not going to happen in my neighborhood, right? So what they tend to think is that maybe California is going to become 150% minority, like super minorities, right? And that's what will tilt the balance for the rest of the country. But what's interesting about this is that this is change that's happening all over the country and also happening all over our metropolitan landscape. So this is a map of the United States that we've been doing with PolicyLink. It's a very easy map to interpret. The browner the county, the browner the county. So the darkest shade, this is 1980, is greater than 50% people of color. The shade in between is 40 to 50% people of color. It's kind of a tipping point. Turns out to be a tipping point in neighborhoods. It's also a tipping point in counties in the United States. And then the lightest shades are less than 40% people of color. In 1980, the country looked like most people still think the country looks. That is, the Black Belt to the south, heading up to DC, the Native American and Hispanic areas of New Mexico and Arizona, and the borderlands of Texas with Mexico. But one thing to notice here is when you look at California in 1980, the only county that was more than 50% people of color was Imperial County on the border with Mexico. Los Angeles had not, for example, crossed that threshold yet. So that's what we look like in 1980, and it's often what people still think the US looks like now, particularly when they think about Oregon and Washington. But in 1990, this is where the country went. You can see the changes happening in California really quickly. The year 2000, and then the year 2010, the last census. You can see the changes broadening. And this is what it looks like when you project the geographic changes going forward. Look what's happening to your state in particular. 2030, 2040. So, diversity is coming to a theater near you. And it's a question of figuring out how do we learn to lead toward that future, and how do we learn to lead in the midst of different populations. I still remember the day that California became majority minority, because demographers said, oh, this is the day, you know how they do that? Like 300 millionth baby was born today. You're like, how did you know that, right? So I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long saying, we're majority minority, we're majority minority, we're majority minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? There was a tone of anxiety in their voice. Finally, I said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. How many of you have been salsa dancing? How many of you took that class right before so you didn't embarrass yourself? Right? So it's part of learning a new step. What are these communities about? What does it mean to lead in different communities? What does it mean to weave different communities together? And one really key thing to note about this diverse change is that while it's happening, again, all over the United States, another thing that's important is it's happening all over America's metropolitan areas.